Imagine wearing this really heavy, suffocating spacesuit every single day of your life.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, and you are absolutely terrified to take it off, right? Because you genuinely believe it is the only thing keeping you breathing.
Right, just protective.
Exactly. You look at the world outside, and it just seems hostile and chaotic and, completely unmanageable without this protective layer. But the tragic reality is that the suit isn't actually saving you. It is slowly starving you to death.
Which is just a chilling image.
It really is. And that is the daily, grueling reality of anorexia nervosa. So today, we are looking at a radical new attempt to get patients to, finally unzip that suit. And they're trying to do it using magic mushrooms.
It is a profound analogy for an incredibly severe condition, honestly. And I think it perfectly frames why researchers are suddenly turning to the rapidly emerging frontier of psychedelic therapy to treat something that is just so deeply entrenched.
Yeah. So, welcome to the deep dive. First, there's a brand new 2026 pilot study.
Hot off the presses.
Right, just published in the British Journal of Psychiatry by a team led by Douglas and colleagues. And they actually gave psilocybin, which is the active compound in magic mushrooms, to adult women suffering from severe anorexia. Because we really want to cut right through the sensationalized hype that so often, just surrounds psychedelic medicine right now.
It's everywhere.
It is. So we are going to examine the real, unvarnished facts from this trial and help you find that crucial balance between genuine clinical hope and rigorous scientific skepticism. Let's unpack this, because before we get into the psychedelics and the mushrooms, we really need to understand the core problem here. Why is anorexia nervosa so notoriously difficult to treat?
That's the big question.
Right, because usually in medicine, you have an illness and the patient wants the illness gone.
Exactly. And that right there is where anorexia deviates from almost everything else we treat in psychiatry. The clinical reality is incredibly grim. Anorexia has one of the highest mortality rates of any psychiatric condition.
Which a lot of people don't realize.
No, they really don't. We rely entirely on talking therapies, which, are the first-line treatment, but the success rates remain just frustratingly low. Between 20 to 30% of cases become chronic. Yeah, you have patients who do not achieve remission, despite decades of prior, just exhausting treatments.
And that brings us right back to that spacesuit analogy I brought up earlier. There is a specific psychological hurdle here. The technical term they use is egosyntonic.
Yes, egosyntonic.
Yeah.
Which is so crucial to understand. Most illnesses are ego-dystonic.
Right.
Think of severe depression or a panic disorder.
Right.
The patient feels like this invasive force is attacking them. They hate the feeling. They want it out of their head. Anorexia is often the exact opposite.
So it becomes their identity.
Exactly. It becomes deeply intertwined with the person's actual identity. It's egosyntonic. The illness is viewed positively by the patient.
Right. They feel safe inside that spacesuit. The rigid rules about food, the intense control over their body, it provides this profound sense of structure in a world that they perceive as totally overwhelming.
That is exactly it. And that explains the intense resistance to treatment. Greater severity of the illness is directly associated with a lower readiness and motivation to change. If you truly believe the illness is your armor against a chaotic world, why on earth would you let a doctor strip it away?
Right. So how on earth do you design a study to convince someone to take off a spacesuit they think is keeping them alive?
What's fascinating here is the sheer intensity of the study design Douglas and her team put together. They knew they needed to do something radical to break that rigidity. So they designed a single blind within individual pilot study.
Okay, break that down for us.
Sure. They recruited 21 adult females who had a primary diagnosis of anorexia that had been present for roughly 3 years on average. And this is key, who hadn't achieved remission with standard treatments.
So we are looking at the treatment-resistant cases, the people who have been suffering the absolute most.
Correct. So over a 6-week period, these women underwent 3 fixed-order dosing sessions of a drug called
Comp 360.
It's a proprietary pharmaceutical-grade synthetic version of psilocybin.
Right.
And the doses were given in a very specific order. They started with a tiny 1 milligram dose first, then a full 25 milligram dose 2 weeks later, and then another 25 milligram dose 2 weeks after that.
But, and I think this is so important, the psilocybin is really only half the story here.
Yeah.
And I feel like this is what gets totally lost in those flashy headlines about, magic mushrooms curing eating disorders.
Oh, absolutely.
They didn't just hand these women a pill and send them home to trip in their bedrooms. There was a massive therapy wrapper around this whole thing.
Precisely. The chemical intervention was paired with approximately 50 hours of intensive talk therapy.
50 hours in 6 weeks.
Yes. It's an incredible commitment. That included a preparation session the day before each dose, active support during the psychedelic experience itself, and then deep integration sessions the day after.
Wow.
And they used emotion-focused family therapy, compassion-focused therapy, and systemic therapy.
And we really have to ask why they chose those specific therapies, right? Because it connects perfectly to the mechanism of the drug itself. Psilocybin chemically strips away the ego's rigidity. It essentially forces the zipper down on that spacesuit.
It does.
So if you just leave a patient there, entirely exposed for the first time in years, I mean, they are going to be terrified.
Exactly. You are taking away their primary coping mechanism. That is why they need that compassion-focused therapy to help them tolerate that raw vulnerability without panicking.
That makes a lot of sense.
And the researchers also actively involved support persons, like family members, in the educational process. Because think about it, when the patient goes home, their family needs to know how to interact with this new, highly sensitive version of their loved one without accidentally triggering the old spacesuit behaviors.
Right. You can't just throw them back into the exact same environment. It is a massive, coordinated psychological intervention, and they condensed it into just 6 weeks. So they've put these women through this intense psychedelic crucible. What happens when they finally finish the protocol?
Well, the positive findings from the study are genuinely promising. The primary measure the researchers used was the global output of the eating disorder examination interview, which is called the EDE.
Oh, okay.
And they saw a significant sustained reduction in these symptom scores over time. To give you the statistical weight, at the 6-month follow-up, the effect size, which statisticians measure as Cohen's d, was 0.98.
Okay, let's translate that for everyone listening, because Cohen's d of 0.98 sounds like purely academic jargon.
It is a bit dense, yeah.
A 0.98 effect size isn't just a minor bump in the data. It basically means the average person receiving this treatment scored better than roughly 83% of people who didn't get the treatment.
It's huge.
Right. In the realm of psychiatric research, where progress is usually measured in these tiny incremental steps, that is like moving mountains.
It is a massive effect size. And it wasn't just the clinician-assessed scores that improved either. The patients themselves felt a profound shift. The Readiness and Motivation Questionnaire, or the RMQ, which measures a patient's self-reported desire to change, also showed sustained improvements over a 12-month period.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, their internal willingness to consider unzipping the suit, so to speak, significantly increased.
And that leads to the big remission number, doesn't it? The study noted that at the 3-month mark, 10 of the participants, which is 47.6% of the cohort, so nearly half of them, had EDE scores that dropped so low they actually fell into what is called the community norm.
Right, basically the remission zone.
Which is incredible for treatment-resistant anorexia.
It really is.
I really want to challenge how we look at adverse event statistics here, because this is a trap that is so easy to fall into.
18 out of the 21 participants experienced at least one headache.
Wow.
Yeah, that means a whopping 85.7% of the participants got a headache. And for nausea, 12 out of the 21 people experienced it. That is 57.1% of the humans involved.
But what happens when we look past the media hype and actually examine the study's design? Because if you listen to the news, you hear words like groundbreaking, staggering, and phenomenal. They frame this as a settled, finalized cure.
Yet if you read the actual words of the study authors, Douglas and her team are exceptionally cautious. They explicitly state, and I quote, "No conclusive findings are reported."
So what does this all mean? I have to push back a little here. If the effect size is a 0.98, which is better than 83% of non-treated people, and nearly half the participants hit the community norm for remission in an illness that is famously impossible to treat,
Right.
Why are the researchers and the academic critics pumping the brakes so hard? Are they just hiding behind academic caution? Or is there a real structural flaw here that invalidates the excitement?
This raises an important question about the rigorous methodology required to actually prove causation in science. It's not about being needlessly pessimistic. It's about not selling false hope to vulnerable people.
Well, let's look at the actual mechanics of the trial then. I was actually wondering about the interviews. They used the eating disorder examination, the EDE, to measure success, but who exactly is scoring these interviews? Because if the interviewer knows I just went through a massive life-altering dose of magic mushrooms, wouldn't they be a little biased in how they grade my progress?
You've hit on the first major flaw: unblinded evaluators.
Ah, okay.
In a gold standard clinical trial, The person evaluating the patient should be totally blind to what treatment the patient received. It prevents unconscious bias. But in this pilot study, the person conducting those vital EDE interviews knew the exact dosing schedule the participants were on.
That is a huge potential for bias. If the evaluator knows you are in the treatment group, they might unconsciously interpret your answers with way more optimism. They might hear a slight improvement and grade it as a massive breakthrough.
The study authors themselves acknowledge this limitation. To be fair, it definitely compromises the objectivity of that massive 0.98 effect size.
And even if we look past the unblinded evaluators, who exactly is getting these amazing results? Because when I look at the demographics of the 21 women, I realized I was looking at a very specific, highly privileged slice of the population.
Yes, the homogeneous sample is the second major issue here. The group was overwhelmingly white British, about 76%. They were highly educated, with over 55% having a postgraduate degree. And crucially, 81% of them were stably employed.
That's a very specific demographic.
It is. They also explicitly excluded anyone with a history of psychotic disorders or substance dependence.
Which means it is incredibly hard to extrapolate these findings to the wider real world. If you think about it, processing 50 hours of intense psychedelic therapy requires a massive safety net.
Oh, absolutely.
A highly educated, stably employed person likely has the financial stability, the time off work, and the cognitive reserve to handle that kind of emotional unearthing.
Exactly. The researchers note this limitation. You cannot assume a protocol that worked for a stable, employed demographic will easily translate to someone struggling with, say, housing insecurities, severe trauma, or complex comorbidities.
Right. There's also the issue of where the drug actually came from. The COMP 360 used in the trial was provided by a company called Compass Pathways, and several of the researchers reported receiving consulting fees from various psychedelic companies.
Now, we need to be very precise here. Conflicts of interest do not automatically invalidate the science.
Right. Of course not.
Getting a drug supplied by a pharmaceutical company or consulting in your field is how a massive portion of modern medical research is funded. It doesn't mean the data is faked. But I would argue the most significant flaw, and the one that really challenges the core findings, is the dosing schedule itself.
I noticed this earlier. They gave a 1 milligram dose, then a 25 milligram dose 2 weeks later, and then another 25 milligram dose 2 weeks after that. Every single woman got the exact same doses in the exact same order.
Which is a classic confounding variable. Because the doses were always given in that fixed sequence and so close together, you cannot legitimately claim which dose actually caused the clinical effect.
Because how do you know? Did the patient get better because the first 25 milligram dose was the magic bullet? Or did they get better because that tiny 1 milligram dose chemically primed their brain and the second massive dose just pushed them over the edge?
Or, to make it even more complicated, did they get better simply because they were wrapped in 50 hours of incredibly compassionate, intensive talk therapy, and the drug just acted as a mild catalyst? Because there was no randomized control group, meaning, a group that got the 50 hours of therapy without the psilocybin or a group that got the doses in a scrambled order. You cannot definitively isolate the chemical effect of the drug from the effect of the therapy in the passage of time.
You just can't separate the variables.
You can't.
And the study authors explicitly admit this in their paper. They say the design did not allow for a legitimate comparison between doses. So let's synthesize all of this and look at the key takeaways. On one hand, we have psilocybin therapy showing incredibly promising cumulative benefits for a treatment-resistant deadly disease. Anorexia is a terrifying protective spacesuit, and this novel therapy, combining a powerful ego-dissolving psychedelic with 50 hours of intensive family-involved support, helped nearly half of these women start to finally take that suit off.
But on the flip side, we must respect the boundaries of the scientific method. This was a small, 21-person, unblinded pilot study without a control group. It is a vital stepping stone, for sure, but it is far from a finish line.
Thanks for taking the deep dive with us today.